appreciate that they tell us that that's happening. So welcome everyone. I am Andrea On. I use she, her pronouns. I am tuning in from the unceded land of the Lenape people. Just really grateful and honored to be here with y'all today. I'm just going to share a brief visual description for anyone who might not be able to see the screen or is joining us in the future. So I'm wearing a blue sweater, an Asian American woman in my 30s with glasses, with gold rims on, long black hair, blue hoop earrings in my office space here with a bunch of books behind me. And, getting into sort of just some context to ground us, not sure if everyone here is from the DJN network, but this talk is with David Dylan Thomas, and it's about design for cognitive bias, using mental shortcuts for good instead of evil, and it's being hosted by Design Justice Network Philly node. And we'll kind of get into the difference between the larger network and the node. So Design Justice Network is a home for people who are committed to embodying and practicing the Design Justice Network principles. And so there are 10 principles that you can find on the Design Justice Network website, and we can provide a link in the chat. If someone could do that, I would super appreciate it. Thank you. But the principles grew out of the Allied Media Conference in Detroit, and it was seeded in 2014 through a Future Design Lab practice space and workshopped over the next 3 years. The network has since kind of grown to become more than just the principles. So around 2017, I think the steering committee members who were kind of holding and organizing the Design Justice Network space created a structure for there to be local nodes. And so this was the point in which steering committee member Sasha Costanza-Chalk and Yuna Lee reached out to myself and Kristen George and brought us together to think about how could Philadelphia bring together a community around these principles and these practices. And so we kicked off the Philadelphia node with a kind of event similar to this sort of Skillshare. And we hosted Design Justice Network Steering Committee member Denise Shante Brown at Slot Foundation in West Philadelphia to kind of just learn more about her practice. And so out of that, we are beginning to think about other ways to kind of bring community together. As a Philly node, I'm just one of many other organizers, of which David is one, Sarah, Nicholas, Maggie, you'll see some other folks in this space, Alicia Atkinson. We are all folks who are kind of stewarding monthly meetings here in online, but also in space together. We sometimes do in-person meetups. And we also have a book club that Sarah and Maggie are facilitating every other week. And Nicholas will give you more information about that at the end. So just to give some context, that's who we are, where we're coming from, and you are also welcome to join any of those meetings and propose a similar Skillshare because David is so graciously modeling what a public Skillshare could look like. Yeah. And so with that, I'll just give a brief intro for David here, who is the author of Design for Cognitive Bias, creator and host of the Cognitive Bias podcast, and a 20-year practitioner of content strategy and UX. He's consulted for major clients in the entertainment, healthcare, publishing, finance, and retail space. He is the founder and CEO of David Dylan Thomas LLC, and offers workshops, presentations on inclusive design and the role of bias in making decisions. He's presented at TED NYC, South by Southwest Interactive Confab, an Event Apart, LavaCon, UX Copenhagen, Artifact, IA Conference, IXDA Design and Content Conference, Emerging Technologies for the Enterprise, and the Wharton Web Conference on topics at the intersection of bias, design, and social justice, and probably so much more. So we are so grateful to have David here just to share wisdom. There's a Q&A at the end of the presentation. Sarah will be moderating, so please hold your questions for the end and use the chat. We invite you to use the chat to share your questions at that point and also to raise your hand. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to David.
Thank you so much. Thank you everybody for coming out tonight. And it's really an honor for me to speak here. I've been a very big fan of Design Justice Network for a long time now, and recently became a member and a very proud member of the Philly node. So I am chuffed, as the English say, to be here tonight. So tonight we're going to talk about design for cognitive bias, using mental shortcuts for good instead of evil. And my name is David Dylan Thomas, and I run this company where I get people excited about and give them tools for more inclusive design. And I wrote this book, Design for Cognitive Bias, which came out in August 2020. And the road to this book actually started with a podcast I used to do called the Cognitive Bias Podcast. And the road to that podcast begins with this woman. Her name is Iris Bonnet. And she did a talk called Design, Gender Equality by Design, which you can find on YouTube. I highly recommend you check it out. And one of the ideas she gets into is this notion that a lot of racial and gender bias often comes down to pattern recognition. And what she means is, like, imagine that you were hiring a web developer, and the image that might pop into your head when I say the words web developer might be skinny white guy. And it's not because you think that men are better at programming than women, far from it, but the pattern that you may have seen growing up in television, in movies, maybe even in some offices you've worked in, might make that equation. And so if you see a name at the top of a resume that doesn't quite fit that pattern, all of a sudden you're kind of giving that resume the side eye. Now, when I saw that something as terrible as implicit racial or gender bias could come back to something as simple and, dare I say, as human as pattern recognition, I decided I need to learn everything I possibly can about cognitive bias. And so that's what I did. I went to this is the Rational Wiki page for cognitive biases. There's well over 100 here. And I took one look at that and realized I am not going to figure this out in a day. So I took one a day, learn about it, next day, move on to the next one. And this turned me into the guy who wouldn't shut up about cognitive bias. And eventually my friends were like, Dave, please just get a podcast. So it's worth establishing from the jump, what is cognitive bias? And at the end of the day, it's really just a series of shortcuts your mind is taking just to get through the day. We have to make something like 1 trillion decisions every single day. Even right now, I'm making decisions about whether or not to take a sip of water, what to do with my hands, where to look. And if I thought carefully about every single one of those decisions, I'd never get anything done. So it's actually a good thing that a lot of our lives are spent on autopilot. But sometimes the autopilot gets it wrong, and we call those errors cognitive biases. So here's a fun one. It's called illusion of control. And it happens when you're playing a game where you have to roll a die. If you need a really high number, you tend to roll the die really hard. If you need a lower number, you tend to roll it really gently. And we all know it makes no difference how hard you roll the die. But in situations where we have no control, we like to feel like we have control. And we embody that by how we roll the die. Now, this next one is not so fun. It's called confirmation bias. And you see it happen when you get an idea stuck in your head and you really only look for evidence to support that idea. And if you ever see evidence that doesn't support the idea, you yell fake news and you move on. So a really powerful example of this came during the lead up to the Iraq War. The whole idea was that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction and we need to go in there and get him before he gets us. It seemed very compelling. As it turns out, not so much with the weapons of mass destruction. And within a year of the war starting, the president of the United States, who had insisted there were weapons of mass destruction, said, yeah, we didn't find anything. Regardless, the number of people who believed there were weapons of mass destruction stayed very high, so high that even 14 years later, over 50% of Republicans and over 30% of Democrats were like, yeah, there were weapons of mass destruction there. So this is an extremely powerful bias, and we will be coming back to it. So these biases are tough to fight. Part of the problem is you may not realize you have the bias. There was literally a bias called the bias blind spot, where you think you don't have any biases, but you're sure everybody else does. Part of the challenge is that about 95% of cognition is happening below the threshold of conscious thought. So you are making these decisions so quickly, you don't even realize you made them. And what's worse, your mind is really good at tricking you into believing that you did think about the decision carefully. Here's how good your mind is at fooling you. After this, try this. Try touching your nose and your toe at the same time. You'll feel it at the same time, but you really shouldn't. It should take a little longer for the impulse to travel from your toe to your brain than from your nose to your brain. But your brain basically says, wait, hold up. Wait for the toe to get here. Okay, both of you come through, right? So your brain is extremely good at tricking you for your own good. So you think you've made these decisions yourself very rationally, but in fact, you're making them at the speed of light. So the next time somebody asks you why you did something, the most honest answer you can give is probably, how the hell should I know? Even if you know about the bias, this is what gets me. Even if you know about the bias, you probably still do it. So there's a bias called anchoring. And the way it works is I could ask everybody in this Zoom call to write down the last two numbers of your phone number. And then I could say, okay, we're going to bid on this bottle of wine. Those of you who wrote down higher numbers, probably going to bid higher. Those of you who wrote down lower numbers, probably going to bid lower. It's called anchoring. It's a thing. But here's the thing. I could tell you all of that before we begin the experiment, probably still do it. In fact, I could say, I will give you cash money not to do it. Probably still do it. So the reason we need to care about bias as designers or people who make stuff is choice architecture. And choice architecture is something you can see if you ever go and try to buy produce, right? Common wisdom is you don't pick from the top of the barrel because that's where the grocer is going to put the product they're most trying to get rid of, right? The older product. They have architected that experience to benefit themselves. Now, they can just as easily architected to benefit the customer by putting the freshest produce where it is easiest to reach. But the point is, however they architect that experience affects the decisions you make in the experience. So think about the decisions your user needs to make. Then think about how people make decisions, not how we think they make decisions, but how they really make decisions, right? Which is 95% below the threshold of consciousness. And there are, as it turns out, content and design choices we can make to help keep some of those harmful biases at bay, or maybe even leverage them for good. So let's go back to that skinny white dude. As it turns out, in experiment after experiment, if you have two identical resumes and the only difference is the name at the top of the resume, if it is a male sounding name, it tends to continue through the process. If it is a female sounding name, it tends to stay in the pile. But here's the thing. Why do you need that information? What about the name is helping you, the hiring manager, figure out who to hire? Think of it like a signal to noise problem, right? The signal, the thing that's actually helping you make the decision are things like the qualifications or the experience. What might actually be getting in the way based on patterns you may have grown up with are things like the gender or the race, or really what you're reading into the name in terms of gender and race. Now, the city of Philadelphia did in fact do a round of anonymized hiring for a web developer position, and they discovered a couple of things. One, the best way to anonymize a resume, even in the sort of high-tech world of web development, is to physically print it out and get a marker and redact it like a CIA document. The other thing they found out is that once they found a resume they liked, they would want to go to GitHub, which is a code repository, to kind of see that web developer's portfolio. Problem is, as soon as the profile of that particular web developer showed up on the screen, all of the personal information would be there and it would ruin the experiment. So clever people that they are, they created a Chrome plugin that would anonymize that information as the page loaded. And then just to complete the circle, they took that code and they put it back on GitHub, and it's there now if you ever want to try this yourself. This isn't just about helping humans make hiring decisions. Amazon created a hiring bot, which was meant to sift through thousands of resumes. And it turned out to be very sexist. So sexist that if it even saw the name of a woman's college on a resume, it would downgrade that resume. So when they tried to figure out how this AI became so sexist, they asked themselves, well, how did we train it? What was the training data? And as it turns out, the training data was the last 10 years of resumes to Amazon, which seems like a reasonable choice until you reflect on what did most of those resumes have in common? It's mostly guys. And so the AI took one look at that and said, gee, it sure must like dudes, and then just kept recommending dudes. We like to think of AI as this sort of cold, objective, Spock-like figure, right? It's very rational, when in fact, it's a glorified prediction engine. And if you point it at a racist, sexist world, it's going to make racist, sexist predictions. I'm actually of the mindset that we should lie to AI and tell it, things like Black people are more likely to get housing loans, right? Just to sort of balance the scales. And by the way, I've talked to AI experts and they also like the idea of lying to AI. But this can go in the other direction too. Amazon Go is a store, you just kind of walk in, take stuff and leave. And the Amazon will kind of auto-magically like deduct, right, what you've taken from your account. And for Ashley Clark Thompson, this had a really curious effect, and she wrote an article for CNET about it called "In Amazon Go, No One Thinks I'm Stealing." And what she's referring to is this concept known as shopping while black, right? And it manifests as kind of hyper-aggressive customer service. Can I help you? Can I help you? No, really, can I help you? For Ashley in the store, there was no one there to do that. And so by removing one key design element, namely the staff, Amazon created a less biased experience for this customer. We're even seeing this start to play out in the justice system. So district attorneys, generally speaking, have incredible leeway when it comes to deciding whether or not to bring charges when a crime has been committed. And perhaps not surprisingly, they are more likely to bring charges if the offender is black than if they are white, even for the same crime. So similar to the resumes, they said, well, why do you need that information in the first place? Right? So they started creating crime reports that admitted the race and gender of the accused, the race and gender of the victim, and even the location of the crime in order to get less biased decisions out of the DA. Now, an important concept for us to kind of grapple with here is cognitive fluency. And it's this idea that if something looks like it's going to be easy to read, I'll assume whatever it's talking about is probably easy to do. By the same token, if something looks like it's going to be hard to read, I'll assume whatever it's talking about is probably hard to do. Now, this is a recipe for pancakes. I've been making a lot of pancakes lately, and the text is kind of small, kind of clumped together, and I might glance at that and think, I bet pancakes are pretty hard to make. I don't know if I'm going to make pancakes. Now, I could take that same content and give it kind of big full width imagery and kind of more scannable chunks of text, and I might think to myself, you know what? I bet making pancakes isn't that hard. Maybe I'll make pancakes. A 2-minute video, forget about it. We're making pancakes. Now, imagine that same rationale when it comes to deciding to drive or take public transportation. I take one look at that printed schedule, and I immediately conclude that it is impossible to use public transportation. I take a look at that app screen, and I think, you know what? Maybe it isn't that hard. Maybe I'll give it a shot. Now, I can't actually see your faces, so I'm going to ask you to kind of vote in your hearts. How many of you think that Rosa Parks was born in 1912? Okay, how many of you think that Rosa Parks was born in 1914? Okay, you're both wrong. She was born in 1913, but people tend to pick 1914. Reason being, if something is easier to read, we tend to think it's more true. But it gets worse. If something rhymes, we actually think it's more true. And this has consequences. Now, what we think is happening here is that people like things that are easier to process. Things that are easier to process feel more certain. And we love certainty. Most biases are really just a shortcut to get to certainty. We love certainty and we hate uncertainty. Things that are easier to process feel more certain. And I'll give you an example. If I were to say, hey, what did you get for your 5th birthday? You got a toy truck, right? You might not feel very certain about that answer, right? It's hard to remember, hard to process. It doesn't feel very certain. If I said, hey, what'd you have for breakfast this morning? Probably feel pretty certain about that answer, right? It's easy to remember, easier to process. It feels pretty certain. Things that rhyme are easier to remember, easier to process. They feel more certain. Things that use big, bold imagery and clear fonts and clear language and pictograms are kind of easier to process. They feel more certain. Now, this becomes important when it comes to things that we need to believe. There's a crisis in America where African Americans, generally speaking, do not believe health information that comes from the government. In a 2002 survey, when given the statement, the government usually tells the truth about major health issues like HIV/AIDS, only 37% of African American respondents agreed with that statement. By 2016, that number had dropped to 18%. Now, we could do a whole other talk about why there are legit reasons that African Americans have concerns about health information that comes from the government. But the fact remains, this is information that could save lives. So if it needs to rhyme, if it needs to use plain language and pictograms, so be it. When I first put this into my book, my very wise editor challenged me and said, okay, that's great in theory, but can you point to actual instances where plain language and pictograms have improved health outcomes. And I'm glad she did, because it made me do the work and find these really great examples. So here we have an instance where we have women who are smoking while pregnant. And when they were given materials written at the third grading reading level, right, easier to process, they're more likely to achieve abstinence during pregnancy, stop smoking while pregnant, and even 6 weeks postpartum. Here you have people who are caregivers, right, helping other people take their medication. And when they were given a plain language pictogram-based interventions, you saw decreased medication dosing errors and improved adherence to actually taking the medication. Now, you might think, okay, that's great for plain language and pictograms, but rhyming, really? Let's talk about click it or ticket. A while back, you have different states roll out legislation that said if you don't buckle your seatbelt, you can get a ticket. And the legislation on its own did a lot of good, especially with older drivers, but not as much with younger drivers. So they rolled out click it or ticket, and the results were that national belt use among young men and women ages 16 to 24 moved from 65% to 72% and 73% to 80% respectively. Now, just to put that in more human terms, for every percentage point you go up in people buckling their seatbelt, about 270 lives are saved. So doing the rough math, that's about 4,000 lives saved, in part through rhyming. It is silly, but it works. The whole easy to process thing even extends to names. There's literally a name pronunciation effect where if your name is easier to pronounce, it can affect things like voting preferences and occupational status, with the caveat that easy to pronounce is a culturally specific thing, right? In some cultures, Smith is easier to pronounce. In some cultures, Mbimo is easier to pronounce. But if your name is easier to pronounce in the culture you're in, you kind of got it made. They looked at law firms, and the higher up you went the ranks in the law firm, the easier the names got to pronounce. We even see this play out with stocks, right? If you have an IPO and the name of your stock is easier to pronounce, it tends to perform better. In fact, even if the little stock ticker abbreviation is easier to pronounce, it tends to perform better. So we will lay down real money on things that are easier to process. Now, the most dangerous bias in the world, for my money, is the framing effect. And it starts out innocently enough. Let's say you go to a store and you see a sign that says beef 95% lean. And next to it, there's a sign that says beef 5% fat. Which one do you think people are going to gravitate towards? It's the same thing, but I have framed one to make it seem more appealing. Now, that's all good and well when we're talking about beef, but what if I said, should we go to war in April or should we go to war in May? You see what I did there? We're no longer discussing if it's a good idea to go to war in the first place. And wars have been started over less. And since the war in the Ukraine has broken out, I've become very conscious of that metaphor. And you don't have to look very far to see how powerful framing has been in the execution of this war. So it really is truly a very dangerous bias. Now, as it turns out, if you are bilingual, multilingual, you can, in fact, have a little bit of a secret weapon against the framing effect. If you can think about the decision in your non-primary language, you are less likely to fall for the scam. So I speak a very little bit of French. And if I try to think about the beef decision in French, it goes something like, let's see, beef, that's bœuf, right? That's a lot of vowels. 95%, that's 89. No, wait. And by the time I've done all that processing, right, I can see right through the scam. And that's what's happening. Thinking about it in a language that's not your primary language forces you to slow down your thinking. And most bias comes from thinking too fast. The foundational work on this is a book by Daniel Kahneman called Thinking Fast and Slow. And the basic premise is that you have two systems of thinking. One is there to help you do things like notice just by looking at someone's face if they're angry, right? You can do that like that. In system one, it's super fast. Another, system two, is more for like, hey, what is 1024 times 426, right? You can't snap judgment that. You have this slower way of thinking. And when bias is kicking in, it's usually because that system one is in play. Thinking about it in your non-primary language kind of kicks you more into system two. Now, as it turns out, the framing effect can actually be used for good. So there's an experiment where you show an audience a photo like this and you ask them, should this person drive this car? And what you get is basically a policy discussion. And some people will say, old people are bad at everything, don't let them drive. And other people will say, oh, how dare you, that's ageist, let people do what they want. All you really learn by the end of that conversation is who's on what side. Now you can show the exact same photo to another audience and ask, how might this person drive this car? And what you get is basically a design discussion, right? Some people will say, what if we change the shape of the steering wheel? Or what if we move the dashboard? And what you learn by the end of that conversation is several different ways that person might be able to drive that car. I only changed 2 words, but by changing the frame of the conversation, I changed the entire conversation. In fact, what if I zoom out a little more and ask, how might we do a better job of moving people around? Because that's why she was in the car in the first place. She was here, but she wanted to be over there. And if I frame it this way, things like public transportation are on the table. This even extends to academia, right? Student evaluations of teachers is yet another area where we see discrimination against women and people of color. Evaluations tend to go lower for female professors tend to be rated lower than male professors for like the exact same coursework. So Iowa State University did an experiment where they kind of said, okay, well, let's put a couple paragraphs in front of that survey for some of the students. And the paragraphs basically said just that, hey, this is an area where people of color, women are generally disadvantaged. And when you are making your evaluation, please think about real criteria and not things like appearance. And the students who got those 2 little paragraphs of framing did in fact rate their female professors higher than the students who did not. I want to close by talking about our biases because these are the ones that can really get our users in trouble. So notational bias is a bias you can kind of see pop up when you think about sheet music. So I grew up playing saxophone and I had to learn how to read music like this, standard Western notation. And I came to think that any music in the world, you could write it down like this, and then I could play it, which turned out to be wrong. I would find out decades later that there is a lot of Asian music, a lot of African music for which this system just doesn't work. And if you make this the default, it is remarkably easy to erase all sorts of culture. Now, we're more used to seeing this when we think about asking for personal information, right? If I have it in my head that there's only 2 genders, and I make my forms that way, I can easily eradicate any number of identities. By the way, while we're on the topic of asking for personal information, you should know about the self-serving bias. The self-serving bias is basically a bias where if something goes right, that's my fault. If something goes wrong, that's your fault. And this plays out with computers, right? If I'm doing something on a computer and something goes wrong, I'll blame the computer. And if something goes right, I'll blame me, unless I have given the computer a lot of personal information. The more personal information I've given the computer, the more likely I am to blame the computer if something goes right and myself if something goes wrong. So we need to be very thoughtful just how often we ask for personal information, because the more we do it, the more we're potentially feeding this unhealthy dynamic between people and their technology. Now, notational bias plays out frequently in kind of structured content. So until 1986, the New York Times prohibited the use of Ms. as an honorific for women. So the way that would work is at the first mention of a woman's name in an article, you would say her full name. And then every mention after that, you would either say Miss last name or Mrs. last name. Now, the pattern this created, and remember how important patterns are, is that the most important thing to know about a woman is whether or not she's married, and then maybe her last name, right? So think about that, right? In article after article for over 100 years, we need to be very careful how we structure content, the kind of editorial guidelines we create, because that is a really, really easy way to scale bias. Language doesn't just describe reality, it shapes it, right? And this is legally true, right? So back in the day, you had Vice President Dick Cheney basically trying to figure out what he could get away with. And he talks to his lawyers and they tell him, look, you are the vice president, which means you are in the executive branch. But you also cast the tie-breaking vote in the Senate, which means you're also part of the legislative branch. But wait a minute, you can't be part of the executive branch and part of the legislative branch. So maybe you're not a part of either. And if you're not a part of either, well, maybe you don't have to follow the rules of either. And he didn't. We see the same thing play out with software like Facebook, right? When it suits them, Facebook will position itself as a publisher. Hey, New York Times, come publish with us. We get you. When someone points out that there are rules for publishers, it's all, I know what you heard, buddy. We're a platform. But there are tools out there to help us be more thoughtful about how we can write more inclusively, right? One of them is Radical Copy Editor. And I'll be sending out a link to a whole bunch of these resources after, just so you know. Radical Copy Editor, and they're really great with helping you think about how to write for folks who generally don't get a lot of say in how they're written about. Another one is Textio, which is especially good if you want to write more inclusive job descriptions, because not everybody wants to be a rock star or a ninja. Another term that I think we should start thinking about is evidentiality. And this is something that some languages have, but English, not really. And it has to do with the verb tense. English tends to use verb tense mostly to tell you when something happened, right? Bob went to the store, Bob is going to the store, Bob will go to the store. Other languages like Turkish make their verb tense do a little more heavy lifting. And it's there to let you know how I know that Bob went to the store, right? So there's one verb tense for I personally saw Bob go to the store. There's another verb tense for somebody told me that Bob went to the store. And a whole other verb tense for, I don't know, I read on the internet that Bob went to the store. Point is, I can't tell you that Bob went to the store without also telling you how I know that Bob went to the store. Now think about how this would affect what people were willing to post, right? What they were willing to say in a speech if they literally couldn't say it without also saying how they knew it to be true. Now, English lacks this as a mandatory feature, but I think we can get creative about how to introduce it. So remember how I said that if things are easier to read, they feel more true? Well, the reverse is also true. If something is harder to read, it feels a little less true. So this is an article from when the first trailer dropped for the most recent James Bond movie. And the first paragraph is basically confirmable information. This is the name of the movie. This is who's in it. The second paragraph is a rumor about why the first director got fired. First paragraph is fairly easy to read, fairly easy to believe. Second paragraph, it's a little harder to read, and it's a little harder to believe. And it should be, it's a rumor. So I think we can start getting creative about how to use design to kind of communicate how many grains of salt some of our content should be taken with. I told you we'd come back to this. So I'm going to tell you a story about how I used to misunderstand the scientific method. I used to think that the scientific method worked like this. I have an idea about how the world works. I am going to test that idea. And then if I get a good result, I'll write down what I did, and a whole bunch of other people will try the exact same thing. If they get the same result, great. Write it down. It's a law. Let's move on. After talking to some actual scientists, I found out it's a little more complicated than that. So I have an idea about how the world works. I'm going to test that idea. And if I get a good result, I'll write down what I did. And a whole bunch of other people will try the exact same thing. If they get the same result, great. I get to spend the rest of forever trying to prove myself wrong. I have to ask myself, if I'm wrong, what else might be true? Okay, let me go and try and prove that. Now, that is a much more rigorous approach, and it was created specifically to fight confirmation bias. Now, as designers, it is very easy for us to leave good design on the table because we fall in love with our first idea. Let me show you just how easy. Let's say we're going to play a game with the computer, and the computer is going to show us those numbers in that question mark and ask us, put whatever number you want where the question mark is, and I'll tell you if that number fits the pattern. Put in as many numbers as you like, and when you're ready, tell me what you think the pattern is. Now, if you're like me, the first number you try is 8. And the computer says, congratulations, that number fits the pattern. Would you like to try another number? If you're like me, say, nah, I got this. The pattern is even numbers. And the computer says no. And the reason it says no is because I never tried this. The pattern is not even numbers. The pattern is simply every number is higher than the number that came before it, which is a much more elegant solution, probably easier to code, probably cheaper to build, but I never got there because I was so in love with my even numbers idea. Now, there are tools out there to help us avoid this outcome. One of them is called red team, blue team. And it's this methodology where you have a blue team who does the initial research, maybe gets as far as a prototype. But before they go any further, the red team comes in for one day, and their job is to go to war with the blue team. They're there to find every hidden assumption, every more elegant solution, every potential cause of harm that the blue team missed because they were so in love with their first idea. Now, part of what I like about this approach is that it's fairly economical, right? I don't have to go to my boss and say, hey, from now on, we got to hire 2 teams for every single job, and they got to check each other's work every single day. No, I need one team for one day to make it a little less likely that we're going to put something harmful out into the world. Another thing I like about this approach is that it highlights the value of outside perspective. So, excuse me, this is a guy named Norman Ohler, and he wrote a book called Blitzed about Nazis on drugs. And the way it came about is he had a friend, a German DJ, who said, hey, when I was growing up in Munich, all the World War II vets would talk about how they were high all the time. Norman takes his friend at his word, does the research, and sure enough, the Nazis kept meticulous records. Here's what they were giving the soldiers. It was basically meth. Here's what they were giving Hitler. It was basically oxy. Oh, and by the way, here's what they were giving the German populace at the time. Now, World War II is not an understudied conflict, right? But historians had completely missed this. Why? My personal theory, the Venn diagram of historians and people with familiarity with recreational drug use is pretty thin. And if our German DJ friend were to go up to your average historian and say, hey, did you know the Nazis were on drugs? A lot of those historians would have said, okay, whatever, junkie. However, Norman, also familiar with recreational drug use, takes his friend at his word and does the research. The point is, if you were to ask me, hey, Dave, we're writing a book about World War II, who should we talk to? My first answer would not be a German DJ, but it would be a great answer. Now, when we're trying to, part of the challenge we do get around trying to design more inclusively is thinking about the unhappy path. And part of this has to do with how we sell design, right? If I say I'm going to redo your website, right, I'm going to talk about all the cool new features I'm going to add and how much easier it's going to be to do your job. What I'm not going to talk about is all the things that could go wrong. But for any cool new feature, there are at least 5 things that can go wrong, right? So we should spend at least as much time designing for what could go wrong as we do for what could go right. Now, part of the problem we have with thinking about the unhappy path is a thing called the survivorship bias. And you can see it play out in the story of Abraham Wald. Abraham Wald was a brilliant Jewish mathematician who lived in Austria in the 1930s, but being a Jewish man in Austria in the 1930s, his life was in danger. He managed to get out before the Nazis moved in and came to the States. In the States, he was asked to help with the war effort. Specifically, they asked him to help figure out where to put armament on planes so that the planes didn't get shot down so much. So they put him in a room, big hangar, with a lot of planes, with a lot of bullet holes, and a bunch of other scientists. And most of the scientists said, hey, it's pretty obvious, right? You just put the armament where you see all the bullet holes. Our friend Abraham says, actually, that's where you shouldn't put the armament. You need to put the armament where you don't see bullet holes. And his reasoning was this. They were looking at the planes that were shot, but not shot so bad that they couldn't make it back. They needed to worry about the planes that were shot so bad that they never made it back. And those planes clearly were shot where these planes were not. They were thinking about the survivors. They weren't thinking about the ones who weren't so lucky. Now, there are tools out there to help us engage in kind of thinking about the unhappy path. One of them is called speculative design. And it's kind of like that show Black Mirror, which if you've never seen it, it's kind of like a Twilight Zone for tech. And you take some near future technology and you tell a story about what would happen if actual human beings got their hands on it. And the results are always terrible. I think anybody working on a new technology by law should have to write a Black Mirror episode about it first. But this is a real job. The folks at Superflux went to the United Arab Emirates to help them think about the future of energy. And the question on the table was, should we continue on the road of fossil fuels or should we start investing in renewables? So one of the things that Superflux did was to say, okay, let's figure out what your air quality is going to be like if you stay on the road of fossil fuels 5 years out, 10 years out, 20 years out. But they didn't just figure it out. They bottled it. And then they made them breathe it. And by the time you get to even 10 years out, it is unbreathable. So by the end of that engagement, the UAE announced they were going to invest over $150 billion in renewables. Another tool you can use to kind of get all your biases out on the table before you begin the work is an assumption audit. And basically, you get your whole team in the room before you really kick off, and you ask these 5 questions. 1, what identities does your team represent? Now, you're only going to self-identify as you feel comfortable, but you're going to think about things like gender or age or income or neurodiversity, right? Then you're going to ask, well, how might those identities influence this thing we're working on? Then you ask, what identities are not represented, right? Who is not in the room right now? Anyone here ever been incarcerated? Anybody here ever had their immigration status questioned? Then you ask, how might the absence of that perspective compromise the design we're working on? And finally, you ask, what might we do to include, honor, and give power to those voices in the design process? And I choose those words carefully. Include, yes, certainly talk to people, honor, maybe pay them for their time, give power. Are there people who are going to be impacted by this work who have absolutely no say in the work? And how do we give them more say because they have to live with what we make? A really great example of this comes from the show The Mandalorian, which, you know, if you're into sci-fi, is takes place, in an alien world, and there's these aliens who speak mostly in sign language. And one of the people working on it said, hey, I have a friend who's actually a deaf actor. Maybe we should have them come in. And they actually ended up helping to develop a really robust kind of like sign language for this alien race. And my favorite part of this tweet is the line, it's our responsibility when we're not in the room to look around and see who's missing. Now, there are actually structures to help us do that work. There is a practice called participatory design, which thinks very carefully about how power plays out through the design process. And one of the first steps in that process is to do what's called a power map, which is what you see here. And so along the x-axis of this, you are thinking about, on one end, low interest, who isn't really interested in the outcome because they're not really impacted by it. And on the other end, high interest, right? Who is interested because they are really going to be strongly impacted by this work. And the other axis is really about power. On the low end, who has low power, right? Who doesn't really have any say in how this turns out. And on the other end, who has all the say in how this turns out, right? And what you're looking for are the people who fall into that lower right quadrant, right? They're going to be really impacted by the work, but they're not going to have a lot of say in it. So an example might be some work that the city of Philadelphia did with the Office of Homeless Services. They were redoing the intake program, right? So the people who would be highly impacted by that work are the people who are, the people who would be highly impacted but have very little say would be the people experiencing homelessness. And then a little bit up from that, people who are providing services for them. So the project of participatory design from then out becomes, how do we give them more power? And a lot of it comes down to accountability and relationship building, right? So I'm not just going to interview a bunch of people and say, thank you for your time and never talk to them again. No, I'm going to come back to those folks in that lower right. And I'm going to say, hey, did we get it right? And if we didn't, guess what? We're not done. And I'm not going to design at people who are experiencing homelessness. I'm going to design with them. It's called co-creation, as some of you may know. And again, until they say, we got this right, we're not done yet. And then finally, before we implement anything, I'm going to ask, hey, did we get this right? And if we didn't, we're not ready to implement yet. And again, we do this because they are going to have to live with what we create. There's a really powerful example of this, and it'll be in the resources I send out to you. University of Montana had a library, and they have a relatively significant Native American population who weren't using it. And so they decided, okay, let's try to fix that. But instead of just saying, okay, we're going to go off in a corner and figure out some app, they said, let's actually co-create with some of the Native American students. And what they found in part was that an app was in fact not the solution. The solution was posters. That was actually a better approach. And I like that story because we can always get surprised, right, in these usually pleasant ways by actually talking to the people, and not just talking to them, but co-creating with, because those posters were created with those students, to sort of see that what we're used to implementing isn't always the best thing. And there's, I won't say always, but very often a much simpler approach that's actually more impactful. The final bias I want to talk about is called the diffamation professionnelle. Told you I speak French. It's a bias where you see the whole world through the lens of your job, which in the workaholic world, a lot of us inhabit might seem like a good idea, right up until it's not. The paparazzi who ran Princess Di up the road that night probably thought they were doing a good job. Technically speaking, they were, right? They were getting really difficult to get photographs that were going to fetch them a really high price. What they were not doing such a good job of was being human beings. The former police commissioner of Philadelphia, a guy named Ramsey, when he first took the job, he asks all of his officers the same question. What do you think your job is? And a lot of them would answer to enforce the law. And he would say, okay, that seems like a reasonable answer, but what if I were to tell you your job is to protect civil rights? Now, that encompasses enforcing the law, but it is a much bigger job because it forces you to treat people with dignity. Now, I've had this slide in here for a while. Every year it gets harder to get through, but I keep it in here because it is clear now more than ever, it is clear that how we define our jobs is a matter of life and death. So he was telling his officers that their jobs were harder than they think. And I'm here to tell us our jobs are harder than we think. It can't just be design cool shit. We need to find a way to define our jobs that allows us to be more human to each other. Now, there are folks working on this. You've got Mike Montijo out of Mule Design, who's created a booklet of design ethics. It's basically like a Hippocratic oath, the first do no harm for designers. I have had this slide in here for a while now, and it's an honor to sort of present it back to Design Justice Network, but I've been a big fan, and the Design Justice Network, right? Part of what attracted me to it are these 10 principles. And I will tell you what I tell other audiences who aren't the Design Justice Network when I'm presenting this, is that they have these great principles. I'm just going to read you the first two. One, we use design to sustain, heal, and empower our communities, as well as to seek liberation from exploitative and oppressive systems. Two, we center the voices of those who are directly impacted by the outcomes of the design process. If you just try to stick to those first two, you've got your work cut out for you. And I highly encourage you to look at the other 8. The whole thing is amazing, and what kind of made me like sign up for becoming a part of this network. It's the difference between what Erica Hall calls user-centered design versus shareholder-centered design. We often think we're doing the former when in fact we're kind of doing the latter. One of the things that makes me optimistic, honestly, about this work is that at the very least, the solutions are there, right? How to think about the solutions are there. This isn't like curing cancer. We have no idea where to start, right? The study of moral philosophy and ethics has been with us for over 1,000 years, right? And places like the Markula Center for Applied Ethics does a really good job of taking all that wisdom and distilling it into key questions we can ask about the work. Which option will produce the most good and do the least harm? That's the utilitarian approach. Which option leads me to act as the sort of person I want to be? That's the virtue approach, right? This wisdom has been here for millennia, but we just need to start making it a part of our design process. Another great tool is the Tarot Cards of Tech. And it's this great website where you go and there are these cards and you click on them and they kind of flip over and they give you these really powerful, provocative questions about your work. So how might cultural change how your product is used, and how might your product change cultural habits? If Twitter had asked itself this before it launched, we might live in a very different world today. Even software engineers are getting into this. So there was the Never Again Pledge, which a bunch of software engineers and data scientists got together and signed when they saw that their work with immigrants, their work was being used to hurt immigrants. And they pointed to a very long and sordid history of data being used to hurt excluded populations. And they said, we don't want to be a part of that history. And here's a list of things we're willing to do to make sure that never happens, up to and including destroying unethical data sets. This kind of collective action is even playing out at places like Google, where Project Maven was a battlefield AI. And when the people working on it saw what it was, they said, we did not get into this business to build weapons. So if you make us work on this, we're going to walk. And Google backed down. They walked away from a $250 million contract with the military. And then they turned right around and did Project Dragonfly, which is a censored search in China project. So this work is ongoing. One thing I do want to encourage you about is if you are looking to make your work or your workplace, more ethical, more inclusive in terms of how you approach to design or any policies you want to change, I want to make sure you know about the consistency bias. And the consistency bias, the way it works is if I come up to you and I say, hey, can I put this big giant sign on your lawn? You're probably going to say no. But if I say, hey, can I put this tiny, just little, you're not even going to notice it. It's just a little more likely to say yes. If you say yes, and I come back 2 weeks later and say, hey, can I put this big giant sign on your lawn? You're actually more likely to say yes because you're sign people now. We like to make decisions that are consistent with our former decisions. And so if I want to roll out inclusive design at my company, I could say, hey, we're going to form the inclusive design committee, and we're going to meet every Monday, and we're going to overhaul the entire design system, right? That is basically a meeting engine. Or I could say, hey, on this next project, can we do an assumption on it? It's like a 2-hour meeting. And the whole project is meant to take like 600 hours. So just give me 2 hours, just right? More likely to say yes. If they say yes, and I do assumption audits on the next 3-4 projects, and I come back and say, hey, for this next project, can we do a red team? It takes about a day, but this is like a 100-day project, right? Just one day. More likely to say yes because we're inclusive design people now. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. Now, this is not some software guru giving a TED Talk. It's Martin Luther King. Over 50 years ago, he saw this to be true, and it is only more true today. So the question I will leave all of us with is, how can we define our jobs in a way that allows us to be more human to each other? Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Dave.
Pleasure.
And hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Montijo. I've been a DJN member since October 2020. I'm so grateful to moderate tonight's discussion. So we just heard about, goodness, I don't even know how many cognitive biases, with examples from hiring bots to shopping experiences, lying to AI, power mapping exercises. Love the shout out in the chat. And so many incredible tools that you just left us with, and that question, which is just really getting the brain juices flowing. So I invite you all to please drop any questions you may have into the chat. You may also use the raise hand function if you'd like to ask your question yourself, opening it up both ways. But huge shout out, Dave. There are so many things that stood out to me: accountability, being inclusive, participating across the journey of design. Amazing. So our first question just rolled in, Dave, from Maggie. Can you talk about cases where blinding can backfire, like the ban the box campaign? Is there a context we should know for this before?
Hey, give me the ban the box context real quick, because I'm not familiar with that one.
Okay, yeah. So someone else jump in if I'm remembering this incorrectly, but basically there was a big campaign to ban a box on like hiring forms that you would have to tick if you were convicted of a felony. And so they said, okay, like there's a campaign to ban the box, but then I think what they found is that it actually led to more discrimination, because without the box, they basically just discriminated against anyone who they thought could conceivably have had to check the box. So like, I was wondering if you could talk about that, because when you talked about resumes and hiring, how sometimes by actually having less information, that can actually lead to more discrimination. And so that was just one example that I could think of, but there are probably others too. Like instituting at like MIT, for example, reinstituted SATs because they felt like SATs, although they're biased, they're like less biased than not having them. So I was just wondering if you knew anything about that generally to give us more insight on that.
I mean, I think the context, thank you for that. I think the context to keep in mind here is that no inclusive design measure works if you actually don't want it to work. What I mean by that is if you don't actually want to hire more people of color for any other reason than I want to be able to check off that box and still keep getting checks from the government, you're not going to have a more inclusive, like the intent matters, right? And so so I was talking to somebody who was doing hiring, and they in fact instituted blinded or anonymized resumes. And what they found out was they would just basically push the discrimination to later in the hiring process, right? So they found once they stepped in and sort of supervised that, right, that the solution wouldn't implement. So you need to want it, right? You need to have a system where it isn't just about, okay, it can't just be, I'm going to make myself blind to whether or not this person is Black, whether or not this person is a felon, I have to consciously want to hire people who are not like me. And what's nice about that approach is it goes above and beyond just, okay, I'm going to make it neutral, which it's kind of a fool's gold. It's not kind of a false dream there because there is no neutral. It's more about saying, no, I really value diversity versus I am forced into it. So I am going to go above and beyond. So maybe I'm going to post that job listing to the HBC alumni before, I post it to, wherever else, right? It's going to change how I seek. But the important thing, I think the important thing in general, the context I want to give here is that any of these inclusive hiring design choices, right, where I'm going to try to use design to mitigate biases that people are just going to bring to the table, whether they want to or not, are band-aids. Like at the end of the day, that pool of web developers is still going to be mostly white and male. And that has nothing to do with the design of the resume and everything to do with systemic racism, right? So if I really want to solve that problem, which I do, we have to start talking bigger than design choices and start talking about education, for example. Because if I want to solve for how many Black people are in that pool, I got to start in 3rd and 4th grade. If I want to solve for how many women are in that pool, I got to start at least at 8th grade, because that's when a lot of women drop out of STEM. So I like to talk about these things in terms of short-term and long-term. While I'm working on the long-term systemic racism, I want design choices that are going to mitigate, right, the bleed from the existing problems. But you're absolutely right. The like these sort of, I'll say, half-assed design choices around anonymized resume processes are going to find those holes. And even like that's truly sincere, I'm going to push and actively try to hire for diversity, are still going to be limited by the bigger systemic issues that you're going to face. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, totally. And that's like pretty consistent with my experience. Like I was on a faculty search committee and we kind of talked like, are we going to anonymize, are we not? And we actually said, well, if we wanted to recruit a diverse set of candidates, we kind of need to know more about their backgrounds to do that. But there's also have to be careful about like not discriminating like for legal reasons also. So it gets complicated, but yeah.
I know a casting director who is in this just Gordian knot of she wanted to hire a transgender person to play this transgender role, but she's by law not allowed to ask whether or not the people auditioning for the role are transgender. So, and it's like, I get both sides of that, but it's like, you know.
Yeah, so it looks like we have a hand raised from Alicia. You want to go ahead and ask your question, Alicia?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Sorry, not on camera just because I'm on my phone, but just want to say like had a little bit of a.
Did she cut out for anyone else?
I think you muted yourself, Alicia.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Sorry, I was just saying had a rough day. Just really glad to be here. This was like a really energizing presentation. So thank you so much. I'm really curious about a lot of things you shared, but the survivorship bias was something that was really new to me that you laid out today. And I'm wondering, I'm just reminded of some of the conversations we've had during book club about like history and stories and whose stories are told and how that kind of influences who survives and like whose stories continue, I guess, to be told and retold. And I guess I am connecting it to like our economic system, capitalism kind of being just like the surviving system that seems to have like dominated our narratives in a lot of ways. So I don't know if you can just speak more. I know you were touching upon a lot of the different biases, but like, yeah, how has survivorship bias shown up, and especially in like racial and economic justice spaces? And I know that's a really broad question, so feel free to take it anywhere, but I just was really compelled by that. Yeah.
No, I'm glad to hear I was able to brighten your day. I too have, I'm sure, of tough days lately, so it's nice to hear I'm able to help there. So yes, I don't know that there's a history bias per se, but there is definitely a thing called availability heuristic, which is the thing that's easiest to remember about a thing, right? We add way more importance than we should. So even though I know damn well that Columbus was a rapist and murderer, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue is actually what comes to mind. And the notion that he discovered America was drilled into me from youth. So that's something I actively have to fight. If I just sort of settle into passive mode, it's just there, right? And that's the power of history. There's a really great episode of Doctor Who, and I'm just going to warn you now, I'm a big Doctor Who nerd, but there's a great episode of Doctor Who where these aliens take over the world, and the way they take over the world is by convincing everybody that they've always been there. Like that's their trick. So nobody fights back because everyone thinks, well, this is how it's always been, right? It's sort of this sci-fi version of propaganda. But if I can convince you that this is the way things should be, I have a very powerful advantage. And one of the best ways to convince you that this is the way things should be is to tell you that this is the way things have always been. So you talk about capitalism. I forget why I was looking this up, but capitalism, depending on who you ask, is basically 5,000 years old, give or take. Humans have been here for 300,000 years. So, you know, it's the new kid on the block. Very, very, very young, right? But we're meant to think that it's like, oh, people have always been capitalists. What are you talking about? And like, I'll give you a perfect example. Co-opting Darwinism to mean capitalism, right? That's literally trying to tie it to evolution and say that, no, even the animals are capitalist, right? Like it's a mind screw. So yes, basically, like that is a very powerful tool. And what makes it so powerful is that once the narrative is established, you don't really have to work very hard to keep it going. So there is a very difficult but very wonderful and important series called Exterminate All the Brutes on HBO that I highly recommend you watch. But one of the main themes is this idea that if you want to do terrible things like colonialism and genocide, you need more than just superior technology. You need more than just germs. You need the will to do it. And that is not something we are born with. in order to get that will, you need to tell stories like, oh, those people you're invading, oh, they're going to go extinct anyway. Yeah, they're not doing well. Or yeah, they're kind of like children, but you're actually doing them a favor by telling them what to do. That allows you to do terrible things, right? And once you've established that narrative and it gets into the brain, remember we were talking about patterns, once the pattern's there, the brain does the rest of the work. The brain just says, oh, I see someone who's darker than me, they must be less important. And like, no one had to walk around following you saying, oh, that person's darker skinned, you should treat them worse. No, once I've established that pattern, I don't have to do anything. And what's really insidious is that it works for people of color, right? There is a belief that people who don't have a lot of money, who vote for tax breaks for the rich, are doing it because they think they'll be rich someday. But when they actually tested and talked to the people, those people had no illusions that they were going to live and die poor. None. They truly believed that rich people deserve good things. That's what we're up against. That's how insidious this is. So 100% history bias is a thing, and it is extremely insidious because once the seed is planted, the work is done. You can just, our own minds get turned against this, and we'll just keep cycling that same bullshit over and over again.
Wow. Thank you for that. Yeah, that's taking it all in.
Sure. Yeah, it's a lot to take in. I mean, what I will say, like, the good news is, like, I like to say that, like, history has a great advantage because it got here first, right? But the good news is that histories can't make any more moves. So one thing that we do have is that we're the ones living in the future. So we actually get to make decisions that history can't. Like, history's already made its moves, it's our move. And one thing I have seen generally that I like is that younger generations are increasingly progressive. Not universally. There are Gen Z people who voted for Trump, have no doubts, but generally speaking, you are seeing younger generations growing up with fundamentally different mores, right? So as a small example, it is much harder to find people under the age of 13 who actually have a problem with marriage equality. In fact, it's very difficult to find people under 13 who even understand why it was an issue in the first place. Like, that is a fundamental shift versus when I was growing up. And I'm going to play the, like, in my day it was like, oh, that's, we don't talk about that. Frankly, especially in the Black community, it's like, we don't talk about that. Right. Whereas this, like, oh yeah.
No, and I think what you just put words to, which I think is really powerful reframing for me, is like, history is just patterns being told, like, is kind of recording patterns that the person in power wanted us to repeat and kind of ingrain in ourselves, and probably in service of their power, I guess, simply put. So it's interesting to hear you kind of now. I think this is like my struggle with how long things sometimes seem to take to change, but I guess like that 13-year-old stack is like, they're just growing up with different patterns. They're growing up with different information and different access to, reality that, like, we didn't even grow up with, which is, so anyway, I'm just, seeing that through a different lens. So thank you for that. Yeah.
Sure.
It feels simpler that way, actually. Like, it's just like, oh, it's just patterns. Okay. We can fight patterns,
Yeah, I get fascinated with systems design because, and you see a lot of this in racial justice movements right now, is that it can't just be a racial justice movement. You have to tackle capitalism, patriarchy, and oh god, what is it? This is like old school bell hook shit, right? But you have to cut. They are working together. You can't decouple them, and the patterns are also like all mixed together. So you have to kind of tackle them all at the same time. But it's funny because I feel like, and if anyone else has questions, please keep jumping in because I'll just keep going. There's a way in which capitalism eats itself. So there's a great video essay about how Disney movies have shifted from having the bad guy be royalty to be capitalist, right? So the old Disney movies, the bad guy was always, or bad woman was always like an evil prince or evil queen or evil prince or whatever, sort of like, or someone trying to usurp the throne, right? And as you shift more modern, it's more like, in Dumbo, it's some like Michael Keaton is playing basically the head of Disney, right? Like it's always these sort of more capitalist interests that are sort of like the bad guy. And they're doing that because that is sort of where the mores are shifting in terms of who we are comfortable viewing as the villain. They are doing this while in fact acting exactly like the villain in those movies. There's a great, again, the video sort of points out how everything that Michael Keaton does in Dumbo is kind of what Disney did while Dumbo was being made, like firing a bunch of people, not giving them family leave, like all this stuff. And it sort of poses this really interesting question of like, you're doing that because it makes money, and you can kind of, but at the same time, you're teaching people to hate capitalism. And it's like, how long can you play that out before it starts to eat itself? And the answer is, I don't know, but I really want to find out.
Me too.
Yeah. Like, yeah, can we, with all this kind of emphasis sort of on framing, you mentioned slowing down, you mentioned kind of zooming out throughout your talk, and this pattern making, storytelling. I'm really curious, how do we start kind of when we want to make things more inclusive, more participatory, whether that's in the workplace or in other spaces in our lives? What are some techniques that you might recommend for us to start doing that work?
Yeah, so I think a lot about, there's the stuff with like the assumption audit I talked about. That's like, I think a really important step. One of the things, I don't know, I think about a lot with kind of trying to be more inclusive at that broader scale, is a lot to do with like how we kind of frame conversations. And like, this is part of a whole other talk I do, but when it comes to policy, I think one of the things that's really slowing us down is that we like to think of policy making as a competition. And functionally now it completely is. Like, the reason a law gets passed or not is basically who's on what side and who wants more power, and like has nothing to do with the validity of the policy itself. Like the actual policy is like the last thing we discuss. And it also makes it very difficult to hear in an inclusive way. All of which is me trying to find an excuse to talk about V-Taiwan. So, so there's a thing called V-Taiwan where this probably almost 10 years ago by now, but in Taiwan, there was in fact a tax policy that was going to get passed that was going to give China way more power over Taiwan. It was similar to some of the protests you saw in Hong Kong over the past few years. And there were protests in Taiwan, and students actually occupied parliament. And instead of turning the tear gas on them, Parliament said, what if we work with you? In fact, what if we take the leader of your movement and give them a cabinet position that we just invented called like digital something something. And they did that. And they came up with a process called V-Taiwan. And the way V-Taiwan works, its intent is to basically crowdsource policy, try to get a whole bunch of people who are living like the life, right? People who are going to be impacted by the policy, have them actually co-create policy. I hadn't thought of it this way before, but it is basically a form of mass policy co-creation. It's meant to be more inclusive. And they made two key design choices that made this more effective than just yelling at each other on Twitter. So first step is you take some topic, let's say it's Uber. That was this is one of the actual case studies. They have the same problem there with Uber that everybody does. So they said, okay, we're going to put out a bunch of just statements, opinions about Uber and ride sharing. And we're going to sort of send them out in texts. And when you get the text, you have the option to agree, disagree, or pass. So it might be a statement like, I think that anybody who works, is a driver for Uber should have a license to do so. And you can agree, disagree, or pass. What you can't do is reply. And that had a profound effect. Because think about it, if I want to troll you by replying with some horrible racist statement, I can't, there's no reply button. Or if I want to put out my own statement, which you could do, you could put out your own statement. And I want to put out some horrible racist statement just to get people's, see the responses that are also angry. I can't, there's no reply button. So that one design choice had a huge impact in that first round. Then the next design choice that was really powerful was to say, rather than show all of this as a list of name, opinion, name, opinion, name, opinion, I'm going to show groupings and see how much of that group agreed with a statement or not. So you might start out with like 4 groups: Uber drivers, taxi drivers, Uber passengers, taxi passengers. And You might find statements that only the Uber drivers liked. You might find statements that only the taxi drivers liked. But occasionally you'd find statements that like the Uber drivers and the taxi drivers liked. And again, it was this visual that kind of glowed green when this one statement, like, and it sort of incentivized kind of consensus, right? Because if I want to have a statement that multiple groups agree with, it's going to have to be at least a little nuanced. If it's some extreme statement, at best, only one group's going to agree with it. But if it's a little more nuanced and is based on things that more people agree with, okay, now I'm going to light up more things. So eventually those 4 groups moved into 2 groups. One was, I think, pro-Uber and anti-Uber. And eventually they found statements that even the pro and anti-Uber people agreed with. So one of them was, I think that taxis should use the same 5-star rating system that Uber drivers do, because we think that's one of the things that makes Uber useful. So that, and it's a very long process, but that ultimately led to actual policy, which said, hey, what we're going to do is we're going to take the technology out of Ubers and put it in taxis, which is a much more subtle solution that I don't think, like here, we would not have gotten to that through arguments in Congress. We would not have gotten to that through yelling at each other on Twitter, right? But I think that those design choices, to get back to the root of your questions, like how do we like make these things more inclusive? I think those helped, right? Because those design choices were made specifically to either add friction to trolling or incentivize consensus. And those are 2 things that I don't think we really engage with when we're designing these conversations or how we create policy. But I think those could be really powerful choices.
Yeah, wow, I had not considered like that's a new concept for me. So thank you so much. We do have about 5 to 7 minutes left of this Q&A portion. Does anyone have a question they're yearning to ask about anything that Dave has mentioned so far? We can talk about capitalism eating its own head. I really.
Oh yeah, we can.
We can go back there. How do we expedite that process?
So real quick, I want to shout out, I don't know if she left, but Cattell was here and she's the publisher of A Book Apart and she's awesome. And I see, I don't know if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Devika Menon, did you create the participatory design map that, because we've got you credited in the book. So I want to thank you for that. That is awesome. I learned, you and Liana taught me about participatory design and I was so proud to be able to put it in the book because it was like, yeah, Philly, we're doing it. And just in general, I want to shout out like, you know, some of the best inclusive design work I've seen, frankly, has been coming out of city government. So some stuff San Francisco has been doing, some stuff Philly has been doing. Like, I can't explain why, but I'm seeing more of that kind of groundbreaking work coming out of municipal design than out of like, you know, pharmaceuticals or, you know, startups or any of these other groups. Like, so keep up, like y'all are being like the shining light on the hill for a lot of this work. So keep that up.
Dave,
that would be so interesting to look into. We should look into why that might be the case.
I was going to say that.
Yeah, sorry, Sarah.
No, perfect. I was like, and why do you think that is? Why do you think that that's the locus of change? Is it because who it's attracting or?
Well, or because it doesn't have the market-based driven solution, you know, the market is more people oriented, you could argue, than a regular design studio that needs to get paid for its services. Sorry, Andrea.
Yeah. No. It's why I moved to city government, thanks to Devika too, who kind of seeded that transition. But it's the only space that I've found where the bottom line is serving people, your residents. So it depends on the space that you're in and what agency you're in city government, but ultimately that's where the goals are, right? Whereas in every other space, in healthcare, in studio spaces, you know, usually the bottom line is make us more money or save us more money. So I you know, that's just personally where I've seen the biggest difference.
Oh, pardon me. I just wanted to very excitedly chime in to say I wholeheartedly agree. As another fellow government person, like I think the municipal aspect specifically is impactful because you are dealing with people, you know, at the state level or other levels, you don't interface with the people in the same way, but at the municipal level, like, you literally like are in the same city. So that local element, I think, also engenders a certain level of accountability. So I'm totally not surprised, and I'm forever inspired by what happens at the municipal level.
Yeah, and it's, to me, I mean, the only reason I sound shocked that at the municipal level you're seeing this kind of progressivism is that government, right, in general is not sort of seen as the most progressive. Like, we've still got, part of the reason we had trouble getting COVID funds out is that a lot of our stuff is still written in COBOL. Like, it's just, right? But it's one of those, like, it shouldn't be surprising, because fundamentally we live in a democracy, and a democracy is theoretically meant to be crowdsourcing policy. It's meant to be co-creating the life that we live. Like, it's the closest we've gotten to, of all the things we've tried, of co-creating the lives that we live. Now, that has been corrupted, co-opted, and kind of always was. I mean, the second you found a democracy, but you're okay with slavery, like, you're going to get what you're going to get. But it is really fascinating to see democracy play out, to see participatory design play out in a municipal function, which theoretically should always be participatory, right? Like, one of the things I'm fascinated about, and some of y'all may know about this, is participatory budgeting. Like, that's like literally putting your money where your mouth is, when it's like, okay, we're going to let you decide how to spend the money. All right, that's deeper than even we're going to let you decide how to do the intake at the Office of Homeless Services. Like, oh, you're letting us control the budget, right? Like that. But like, that shocks me, but it shouldn't, because we live in a democracy. Like, that should be the norm.
Yeah, it's so true. I want to acknowledge, Sherilyn, that sources to follow for examples. Could you clarify examples for?
Well, it's going so fast, I'm like, how am I going to catch all this? I think sources to follow in terms of the progressive work that's being done at the local municipalities. I'm in Seattle, and I think we could use some of that. I think we could use a lot of it in a lot of different places.
Speaking of the education space, I will send a list of resources out, and we can circulate to just everyone who attended. But I think one or two of the resources talk about that participatory design project I talked about with University of Montana. So that's a good one. That's at least education adjacent that you might be able to look to. And they created an inclusive, an indigenous inclusive toolkit, design toolkit. So you can sort of pick that apart to sort of see what does and doesn't work for you. But that, I'll make sure you get a hold of that at least.
Great. I love all this local city gov love that's outpouring here. That's amazing.
Yeah, and you can also see, if you're familiar with Sarah Winters, who was one of the founding kind of like partners in like how gov.uk became like the gold standard for government digital spaces. So she talks about this, and she had her fun with sort of like, and I think this is part of the reason you don't see this more broadly, but she had like, that was a fight. That was not an easy thing to do. And there would be phone calls with government representatives who would say things like, do you know who I am? Which, if you think about it, is the most ironic and weird thing for a government public servant to say, do you know who I am? Right? That ego can exist in that space. Like, I get why it exists in that space, but it's like kind of the last space it should exist in. So I think that's part of the reason this isn't the norm, but she was able to kind of like start rolling that at the national level. And 18F is an organization that, if you have not heard about, you should hear about. They also, at the governmental level, are kind of doing a lot of this very forward-thinking progressive work. And again, I think part of the reason is they don't get funded normally. Like, they weathered Trump because that wasn't like the EPA where Trump could just defund it. It has this weird like GSA like funding model. So you kind of have to work really hard to defund it. But I think where the money comes from makes a huge difference in kind of like whether or not these things are able to play out.
Yeah, we've got some incredible resources being shared in the chat.
Oh yeah, Code for America.
Thank you, everyone. Follow the money. We always come back here. We are at time. I'm going to hand it over unless anyone has any last burning questions. I'll pass it over. Thank you again, everyone, for your questions. I think the resources we agreed will be shared. So, Nicholas, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. So I'm going to share my screen really quick. I'm another co-organizer of the Philly node. If like you're really interested in this talk or you've been following us in the past, let's see here, and would like to get involved, or are curious about like what that looks like, I could just go over a couple of different things here. Let's see. Okay, so there are a couple of different meetups that we have, monthly meetings, and then some that happen kind of at a different cadence. So we have a monthly meetup. The next meeting that we have will be Tuesday, April 26th at 7 Eastern time. And in these meetings, we all kind of come together and share things that are happening in our network, things that we're interested in. We plan maybe for future events. We've done some of these meetings in person in the past when the weather's been good, so we might do that again if you're looking forward to meeting in person and kind of are tired of the Zoom stuff. We also have a book club, which has been facilitated beautifully by both Sarah and Maggie, who are both here today. So we'll be meeting at the end of April. That date hasn't been decided yet, I don't believe. If it has, please, I'll update this. And the way that this is working is it's actually really easy to just jump in. The way that it's being facilitated by Maggie and Sarah is that they curate basically a list of readings, kind of like an excerpt from this book here, a YouTube video over there, maybe a podcast. And then we have a discussion around all those things, and they provide all the materials. So it's you don't have to buy any books necessarily or buy any of the materials. You can just read as much as you want or engage with it as much as you want, and then come with thoughts and their kind of guiding questions. Usually kind of around a theme. So last book club, we focused on decarceration and carceral thinking and the systems there and how they intersect with design. So it's a really great opportunity to kind of learn and read like a really wide variety of things. So if you're interested in that, we can send more information there. And then Skillshare is a form where we've started like this lovely talk that Dave gave, where members of our community kind of share things that they would like to show or information that they'd like to share. And anybody can do this. If you have a talk or a skill or something that you think people would like to learn about, feel free to reach out and we can schedule something. And then I think that's kind of what we have right now. If you want to kind of keep an eye on some of these events, go to designjustice.org/events. I think maybe some of these links are being posted in the chat. I'm not sure though. And then here are a couple of resources. So Design Justice Network, in some ways, it's one of its big resources is this book written by one of the co-founders, Sasha Costanza-Chock. It's basically, we kicked off our book club. It's an amazing resource to have, but there are also a couple of other ones. Here's a couple of zines that you can access online that cover things from the design principles, emerging practices, how to start a node if you're not in Philly and you live in a city that doesn't already have a node. So, and a couple of other things. So if you'd like to get involved, you can email us at dgn.philadelphia@gmail.com. We have an Instagram and then the website. So thanks everybody for joining. I think that's it for me.
Thank you, Nicholas. And just seeing Venus, your message about Montreal, I believe there's one in Toronto, a DJN node. So I would check out the DJN website and, you know, see if you can get onto the DJN Slack. But beyond that, thank you so much, everyone. And I hope you have a really wonderful evening.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, David. That was incredible.
Thank you all so much. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.